Hey there, I hope you're all doing well. A little music trivia for you. Are You Sure Hank Done It This Way is a song written and recorded by American country music artist Waylon Jennings. It was released in August 1975 as the first single from the album Dreaming My Dreams. It's an homage to Hank Williams' contributions to country music, while offering a critique of the glitzier, more produced direction country music was moving toward in the 1970s. Jennings examines where he saw country music was headed and questions if Hank did it that way. For its time, the song was a fair evaluation of the state of affairs of the industry. If the focus of the powers that be in Nashville is primarily on materialism, what does that mean for the quality of the music? And what does this shift from the raw emotional nature of the genre to placing a priority on aesthetics do to the authenticity of country music? Are the fans getting what they want, or are they getting a corporatized version of country music? Another interpretation is Jennings may be pointing out that country music is too stuck in the past, and that a change is needed to survive what he views as pre-existing influences which are detrimental to the industry. And to fix those problems, meaningful change involves a culture change. I think this critique has a lot of different applications, not just for country music, but for example, if you've ever worked in a corporate environment, you know initiating cultural change is never easy. While driving the other day, I happened to be listening to this song, and that's why I'm on the subject of change. It got me thinking about amateur radio and some of the people I've seen on the internet making generally negative comments about the culture, and others who attempt to control the narrative about the state of affairs of amateur radio. Some also want to be the middleman, it seems, between what is and what isn't real with the culture, and at the same time have something to sell you. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against anyone trying to make a buck, nor do I think everyone who sells radio gear is a purveyor of the stigmatization of ham culture, but there do seem to be a lot of grifters out there. The reason I'm saying this is because it seems these days you can't swing a dead cat on the internet without hitting some form of content talking about ham fuds or hearing someone's indictment of amateur radio. For those unfamiliar with the term FUD, the original connotation, as I understand it, refers to gun owners who view firearms only for hunting or sport shooting, and may be opposed to the ownership of semi-automatic firearms intended for personal defense because the use of those types of firearms don't fit in with their worldview of what they think others ought to have. This term has been broadened as a pejorative for amateur radio operators who are deemed rude, dismissive gear snobs, or offer unsolicited opinions. Certainly, arguments have been made that some in the ham radio community haven't done themselves any favors with the way that they act sometimes, and whether it's intended or not, in some ways contribute to perpetuating this stigma. Some of the points I've heard others make about hams as to why this stigma exists is because there are those within the amateur radio world who feel they're entitled to constantly police, correct, and belittle others, as well as hide behind the FCC rules when offering their online criticisms and use the rules as a cudgel to justify being nasty to people. As the actor John Cleese of Monty Python fame once said, there are people sitting there who are deliberately waiting for the thrill of being offended. That seems to be the case with a lot of people who roam the various internet forums and comment sections. Conversely, there are some unscrupulous individuals who want hams to help them with specific technical questions so they can engage in unlawful activities, which I think is part of the reason why so many are quick to cite FCC rules. In those situations, I think it's an unfair criticism to call someone a FUD for being cautious about certain questions, because no one wants to potentially risk being fined or lose their license over anything that could be construed as unlawful. And in those situations, I don't fault anyone for wanting to protect their license, which they put a lot of study time, money, and effort into. I've often heard people claim that amateur radio is dying. If it did die someday, I have no doubts there would be some who would be delighted to dance on the grave of ham radio. because they would justify this as payback for an anecdotal encounter they once had with a ham they perceived as a FUD. I think there is both reasonable and unreasonable criticism of ham culture, and much of it is very subjective depending on who you talk to. It seems lately you're hard-pressed, though, to find anyone that's actually objective on this subject, because you either find someone that tells you the culture is completely toxic, or they refute this idea altogether because one of those opinions suits their personal agendas. The reality is, ham culture is no different than anything else. There are pros and cons. There are also aspects of it that I think people may not have realized until they got interested in it. For example, one aspect I don't think people realize exists is a long tradition of self-policing and strictly following FCC rules. This is one of the reasons when you ask a ham a question, their response might begin with telling you what the rules are. Some of them do this because the answer may be codified somewhere and it simply may be the best answer available. In addition to the self-policing aspect, there is also something called the Volunteer Monitor Program, and that's an agreement between the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL, and the FCC to train volunteers to monitor the airwaves and collect evidence of misconduct, as well as recognize exemplary on-air operation. Any conduct deemed to be in violation is referred to the FCC by the ARRL, who then determines if action should be taken. I think these are a couple of areas where some people may view this part of the culture as a good thing, while others may not. Within amateur radio are a lot of varying interests, such as contesting or other events designed to win awards or showcase certain skill sets. On average, I think those who are into events like contesting are probably more into the hobbyist aspect, and they enjoy amateur radio purely for the purpose of the fun of radio. For example, there's something called worked all zones, and this is awarded to any ham who's able to present proof of making contact within all 40 CQ zones. Others enjoy going on fox hunts where participants use radio direction finding techniques to locate one or multiple radio transmitters hidden within a given search area. There's also people who are into the emergency communications aspect, which is where I tend to fall. So when you're talking to another ham, don't assume you're both on the same page, because they may have a completely different reason for being involved in amateur radio than you do. Some of you watching may not be hobbyists. Perhaps you're someone who's into prepping, or maybe your focus is on other aspects of radio. If that's the case, the folks who enjoy contesting may have diametrically opposed comms goals compared to yours. I think it's important to keep in mind that while people get into amateur radio for a lot of different reasons, and despite those varying interests, there is room for everyone. Of course, all these factions learning how to play well together may be an obstacle, and I won't dig too deep into that, but perhaps it's a point of discussion for another video. Another area of the culture I've heard people cite that seems to be a sticking point is gear snobbery. Some of you may already have a radio you've been playing around with. Maybe it's a Baofeng UV5R or something comparable, and you purchased it because it was inexpensive. If you're on the internet enough, there's a good chance you may run into someone who disparages your radio, tells you it's junk, and that you should buy a radio they recommend. I think this is something that drives people away from amateur radio. Whether intended or not, belittling someone's equipment is a good example of how people are pushed away from radio, because right out of the gate, you're being criticized for your radio choice and being told you're already doing things wrong. In the amateur radio world, you'll quickly discover there are more opinions than you can shake a stick at, so take the ones you hear with a grain of salt. To counter the negative, there are also a lot of smart people who are willing to help you from time to time. My advice would be not to spend your time with negative or potentially toxic people. If you're trying to determine if someone's a good influence or not, they usually aren't hard to spot. The ones who are more concerned with helping you become more proficient in your skill set are the ones you want to surround yourself with. The ones who concern themselves with what you buy or whom you buy from probably have an agenda, and it's not to help you be a better radio operator. Another thing I don't think people realize is just how small the amateur radio community is. Out of 330 million people in the United States, approximately 700,000 hold an amateur radio license. I believe there are somewhere around 3 million hams worldwide. Unfortunately, not every ham is a good ambassador for amateur radio. However, I do think the majority of that 700,000 are generally nice folks who are welcoming to newcomers. At least that's been my experience with the majority of the ones that I've met in person. And I know that's a small sample size. However, if you only watch certain content creators, you would get the idea that all hams are mean-spirited. Unfortunately, it only takes a few highly vocal and negative people to make the rest look bad. I don't know for certain if all the online interactions claimed by certain content creators who push much of the ham FUD narrative are real or not, but I think the chances some of them being fake aren't zero. The reason I think some of these alleged interactions may not be real is because some of these creators are profiting off keeping the stigma going. And I think when someone is pushing a particular narrative and profiting in some way, it's fair to ask what's real and what isn't. But I know sometimes if you say the quiet part out loud and make certain observations, people tend to attack you for it. People do love their cult of internet personalities and don't like anything that threatens their version of reality. Whether it's generating ad revenue or pushing a product you can buy with a creator's promo discount code or getting you to pay to subscribe to be part of their social clubs, I think some of what you see is window dressing created to separate you from the money in your wallet. I think for other content creators, they either run out of substantive content over time and creating controversy is their way to stay relevant. That's not to say all of the negative interactions with hams and content creators are fake. I don't think all of them are. I do think some of them are. There are some jerks out there, of course, and there are some who do troll content creators, but I don't think it's as prevalent with hams as some would lead you to believe. Depending on who you listen to, though, you would think there's a ham FUD under every rock and around every corner. No matter where you go or what you do, you're going to encounter a few idiots. That's just life. But I think the demand for ham FUDs is greater than the supply, and I think that's where some of the interactions we see may be invented. I know some may enjoy the soap opera that's being presented, but what is really at stake in all of this? I think if we allow radio in general to become viewed as so toxic that no one wants to keep it going, then our society will have a much bigger problem on our hands. My point here is if radio does die someday, then governments and some of the corporations in bed with governments will grow their monopoly on how the public communicates. Earlier I mentioned if amateur radio does die, there would be those who would gladly dance on its grave. But that's just cutting off your nose to spite your face. For those who would downplay fear of censorship in this country, just keep in mind that people have been trying to censor each other for a very long time, and I don't think that there's evidence that trend is slowing down anytime soon. History's full of examples of individuals, groups, and governments trying to censor others in an effort to control a certain narrative or the means of communication. For example, you can go all the way back to 399 BCE when the philosopher Socrates was sentenced to death for asking political and philosophical questions of his students. Or in ancient Rome, when the office of censor was created initially to conduct a census, but encroached into other areas such as the moral conduct of citizens. But we don't have to go that far back. There are some recent examples, such as Egypt during the 2011 Arab Spring and the Hong Kong protest of 2014. During those events, their respective governments shut down the internet to keep their populations from communicating. I know we enjoy many freedoms in this country, but that can happen here if we let it. As long as people desire power, who's to say some of them won't do anything to maintain their grip on it? Maintaining that grip in part means controlling narratives and the flow of communication. The 2011 protests in Egypt expanded to countrywide demonstrations as the Muslim Brotherhood and some portions of the military were politically at odds with each other. The Muslim Brotherhood won the presidency and a majority of seats in the parliament. However, this political victory didn't last long, as Egypt's judiciary voided the vote and dissolved the 2012 legislature. The following year, the army removed then President Morsi, which caused many Egyptian citizens to begin protesting the removal of a democratically elected president. The state deployed forces to quell the protest, and several hundred protesters were killed. At this point, Egypt was in a state of emergency and used any means at its disposal to retain control. In the state's attempt to keep the population under control, they amended their constitution to redefine the military's role and functions, created laws to ban gatherings of more than 10 people without authorization, and prohibit political parties established by religion. In addition to this new legislation, the state blocked several websites from public access, such as WhatsApp, Twitter, and Facebook, and eventually the state shut down the internet, official domain name servers, as well as the short messaging service. The state was effective in their efforts to control internet traffic across Egypt. However, the authoritarian approach of the state to create an information blackout seemed to have the opposite effect of what they intended. The blackout caused many to go out into the streets seeking information on what was happening, culminating in protests. Eventually, the internet was restored. However, in the aftermath of the blackout, citizens began discussions on what could be done to communicate should they face similar future censorship efforts by the state. Some solutions proposed were Tor as well as mesh networks. In 2014, Hong Kong experienced a series of protests referred to as the Umbrella Revolution, where the state's proposed electoral reforms were the catalyst for demonstrations. However, unlike Egypt's Arab Spring, technology would play a large role in the organization of protests. As with Egypt, Hong Kong's protesters face similar censorship efforts by their government. However, the Umbrella Revolution protesters leveraged mesh networks such as FireChat, where instead of routing traffic through base stations, they leveraged nearby mobile phones to communicate directly with each other, which is called peer-to-peer networking. This alternative communication tool enabled them to continue their coordination efforts with each other as opposed to figuring out a solution in real time. These examples underscore the importance of having alternative communication methods independent of telecommunications networks, which is why radio is also a valuable tool and why it's important to look past the drama of ham fuds or whatever flavor of kabuki theater is playing out online and keep your focus on ensuring our existing communication tools are available in the future. I know sometimes toxic people are successful at getting others to take their focus off their goals. One day you're excited to have passed the Element 2 exam and ready to explore ham radio, and the next thing you know, you're defending what radio brand you have because it's not the right one according to someone's opinion. No matter if it's a hobby or a profession, being around toxic people will derail your plans every time. Don't get distracted by the gear others think that you ought to have. Focus on how to be proficient with what you do have, and once you accomplish that, then by all means upgrade to better equipment. Amateur radio isn't a fashion show, and it shouldn't be treated as such, although I know there are some who would like it to be exactly that. The price point of the radio you start out with is inconsequential. If you can only afford a certain radio within your budget, then stick with that. Whatever your basis for the equipment you have, it's not anyone's business where or how you spend your hard-earned money. But once you do have a radio in hand, then learn how to manually program it, learn the menu and what those menu items mean and how to apply them. Start listening to traffic on your local repeaters and get a feel for the terminology. That way, when you're ready to get on air, you can do it with confidence. I know I didn't touch on every issue related to this topic, and I'm not sure it would enhance the debate if I went any further. So I'll leave you with this. I don't personally care what radio you have because I'm not a brand cultist. I don't care if you have a Bofang, Kenwood, TYT, or Motorola because that's not my philosophy. My philosophy is it's the Indian, not the arrow. That's an old quote from the golfer Lee Trevino. He's right. The equipment doesn't make the person. It's you, your knowledge, your determination, and ingenuity that are the most important. As for the direction of amateur radio, I think the foundation many hams previously laid is still strong. However, I think an argument can be made that the culture could benefit from some change. Part of that means a partial shift in culture. Instead of focusing on gear worship or running down another's equipment, finding ways to get a new generation of people interested in radio, as well as mending fences with those who have differing comms goals. Despite our differences in opinions and approaches to communications, we actually have more in common than some may realize. And each of us has a stake in ensuring radio is around for our posterity. Of course, this entails all of us getting over ourselves and setting our egos and differences aside to effectuate positive change. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.